Hi, my name is Ray.
Hi, this is Michael.
Welcome to another episode of Ray's Economics Clue Book. Today talking about Introduction to Externality.
Okay.
So positive and negative externality. Consumption or production of a certain good or service results in a spillover cost or spillover benefit for many third-party individuals. For instance, in our very private market, we have obviously our market equilibrium and production point at that equilibrium point.
Sure.
However, that equilibrium point doesn't explain all costs and benefits in the economy.
Yeah.
Because in a market, there are a lot of maybe not indirect benefits or indirect effects of production and consumption of a certain good or service for the rest of society, basically. For instance, a look at positive externalities or positive indirect benefits of consumption or production, like education, taking a train, vaccines, things like that. Like education, what positive externalities exist for education? Well, not only in the market for education do you provide education to the consumers who demand it, but you also, once these consumers have the education, they improve their human capital. Human capital is one of the parts, a type of capital that is involved in one of the four types of factors of production: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, of production. And so by improving human capital through education, we improve overall economic productivity of laborers, for instance, and overall economic production for everyone in the economy increases just because people get education. So that increase in productivity and increase in economic output and benefits.
The real output. And also
that's indirect benefit or an positive externality from the education market.
Yeah, another example is vaccine. For example, right now it's 2020, right? So we have the COVID-19 problem. So, but when you take the vaccine, and you at least reduce the infection rate for other people, okay? Because you are vaccinated. So, the vaccine whole size is going to have external benefit to all the rest of the people in the society, right? So that's another example about the external benefit. But in this case, we not only just considering the private benefit, marginal private benefit, we have to consider the marginal social benefit for this product.
Yes. So as Michael mentioned, in the case of vaccines, for instance, the marginal private benefit will obviously be you as consuming the vaccine, or you taking in the vaccine, you would create a certain level of immunity for yourself. However, that marginal external benefit is your immunity also creates immunity or creates a lower infection rates for other people, because when you're immune to the virus, you may reduce your chances of you being a carrier as well. As a result, you create you're responsible for less infection risk for other individuals. So that less infection risk for other individuals coming from you, a vaccinated person, is a marginal external benefit. And so the marginal social benefit overall, social being the benefit for the entire society, is equal to the marginal private benefit, or basically the free market equilibrium plus our marginal external benefit, the indirect effects or unintended effects of a good or service. While in this case, with no negative externality, a marginal social cost equals a marginal private cost. So you see here, since marginal private benefit is what we'd reach under a free market, then the additional marginal external cost is left out. And so in a free market, a pure free market, often a good is often unconsumed without government intervention. It has a positive externality.
Yeah, well, we're going to see details in the next few slides. But on the other side, we have negative externality, right? Like coal mine, like cigarettes, and so forth.
So for like coal mines, for instance, they produce pollution. That's a negative externality, and maybe an unintended indirect effect from coal mine production. So in this case, marginal social cost in this case is a marginal private cost plus our marginal external cost, while marginal social benefit equals marginal private benefit if there's no positive externality. So as a result, for instance, like coal mining or cigarettes, alcohol, these things are overproduced without government intervention, because marginal social cost is higher than marginal private cost. And marginal private cost is what we reach under a pure market, a free market, with no government intervention. So what do we mean by underproducing, overproducing? Well, so first of all, let's look at the case of a positive externality in consumption. So in this case, our free market, our classical free market, here's our marginal social cost, which equals our supply curve, or equals our marginal private cost in this case. And our marginal private benefit is also the same as our demand cost curve in this case.
Yeah, so the free market equilibrium always means private benefit equals private cost.
Yeah, so in our free market, we produce at a price P1 and a quantity Q1. However, there's a marginal social benefit as well that includes our marginal external benefit. Our marginal external benefit is basically mentioned through the gap right here, because the gap right here is essentially and represented by price, the gap in production from how much we should be producing compared to how much the free market produces on its own.
We should have demanded more.
Yes. And so we see here that marginal external benefit is that gap produces our marginal social benefit curve as right here.
Yeah, it basically says MEB equals MSB minus MPB. That's it.
That marginal
right?
social benefit curve, this curve right here, closes the marginal external benefit gap right here.
Yeah.
So our socially optimal point of production, where the marginal social benefit curve meets the marginal social cost, or supply curve in this case, is where is Q2 at price Q2 or at quantity Q2, price P2 and a quantity Q2.
Yeah, that means socially efficient.
Yeah.
When we say socially efficient equilibrium, usually that really means the marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we see here. Since Q1 and Q2, there's a positive difference between the two quantities, and so that is the positive difference represents how much the free market on its own underproduces compared to the marginal social benefit. And so in order to increase Q1 to Q2, our socially efficient point, then we need a Piagovian subsidy. Now, in the classical or in our private benefit demand curve, to produce at Q2, we need to produce at price P0.
Yeah.
So we need
that really means at Q2 people can demand it, but only at price P0.
Yeah.
Okay. So in order to make that Q2 happen, government has to provide this subsidy because the supply curve at P2, which means the producer will produce at P2 price.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in order, because producers will produce at P2 in order to produce Q2, and so in order to move our production point to Q2, we need to get this price overall or the return to the producer at P2. So we need a subsidy that's added on to what consumers pay in order to get our returns for our producer to P2.
Yeah.
And so we need this Piagovian subsidy right here to reach P2, and that Piagovian subsidy will ultimately increase our production point to Q2 as well, which is our socially efficient or socially beneficial point.
Yeah. On the other dimension, if we do nothing, there's a deadweight welfare loss.
Yes, indeed. And so basically, we see here the Q1, Q2 gap right here. That is our underproduction point, underproduction amount in our pure free market compared to our socially efficient production point. And so our deadweight welfare loss right here, basically this horizontal point represents our production
consumption gap. Yeah, we should have demanded more, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And our marginal social benefit curve, to produce at Q1, we produce at price point right here, and our equilibrium we produce at this point. And we see here we have a gap this much containing our underproduction point for our market, and so that all combined makes up our deadweight welfare loss. It's the amount of welfare loss because of our underproduction in our pure free market compared to our socially efficient point. This is very similar to, for instance, deadweight loss in regular markets versus for a lump sum tax or for an excise tax. We see a lot of deadweight loss in terms of total surplus. That's very similar in that regard. This case is kind of like welfare surplus.
Yeah, and just one more thing, that Piagovian is a British economist in 1920s. He basically first introduced this subsidy and externality concept. I think that's really very useful, and also just remind you guys that this subsidy is per unit. It's not a lump sum, but it's a per unit subsidy.
Indeed. And so for a marginal social cost, it's the same story. For instance, we see here, if there's no marginal external benefit, then our marginal social benefit is equal to our marginal private benefit, which in this case equals our demand curve right here.
Yeah, that's usually happening in the negative externality production. For example, coal mine, right? There's a lot of toxic gas, right? So that's a overproduction. Of course, without any government intervention on the free market, we have private cost equals private benefit, right? Marginal private cost equals marginal private benefit. So we're going to have Q1 quantity of what? Production. Okay.
And so here our marginal private cost is just the same as our market supply cost or market supply curve in this case. Our marginal private cost curve is the same as our market supply curve in this case. And so we see here, in our regular free market, we produce at price P1 and quantity Q1. However, we have a marginal social cost represented by the gap here in our marginal external cost. So in order to cover that marginal external cost gap, we need to cover that by having a marginal social cost curve at this point.
Yeah, we have to count the external cost because it does exist. And for the society as a whole, the cost is much higher than marginal private cost.
Remember, just like our marginal external benefit gap, our marginal external gap is basically the gap between the price point that the marginal social cost curve would be at our current production point Q1 versus the price point that we are currently at in our regular market at price P1 for come to Q1.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. The MEC equals MSC minus MPC. Yes. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay.
So to cover that gap, we have our MEC curve is all the way over here, and so we see here in our socially efficient production point is at Q2. Our socially efficient production price or return for our producers is at price P2.
Yeah.
And so we see here this negative gap between Q2 and Q1 shows that we are overproducing. We should be producing less at Q2 rather than producing currently in our free market at Q1.
Yeah.
So that gap between our Q1 free market point and our Q2 socially efficient point is our overproduction point. And so in order to cure that overproduction point, we need a tax. In this case, a tax is reduce production and reduce consumption as well.
Yeah.
And so for the tax, so at our marginal socially efficient point at price Q2, quantity Q2, we have return P2 for producers. However, in our regular demand curve, our regular supply curve, producers will only be willing to produce that at P0.
Yeah, it's pretty simple because on the demand asks the P2 because under that Q2 the demand is linked also, right? Because the quantity. But actually they are only willing to produce the P0 right here under the private. So we have to put a Pigovian tax so that under the social cost curve they can the producer they can get to the equilibrium at Q2.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, Pigovian tax is per unit.
Yeah.
Okay. And we also want to point out, actually, when we say free market, the private equilibrium Q1 is always private cost equals private benefit.
Yes.
And the social optimal always social cost equals social benefit.
Yes. And we see as a result, we have the same thing here, deadweight welfare loss due to overproduction. Our deadweight welfare loss is basically the gap between our price points at MSC minus MPC, which is our MEC gap right here as our vertical point, and then the horizontal region right here, that is our overproduction point. And so that combined and creates this triangle here as our deadweight welfare loss as a result. The same concept.
Yeah. So by this Pigovian tax, the government basically force the coal product becomes more expensive, so the demand also reduced to Q2.
Yeah.
And at this time, before the tax, the producer only supply at Q2 also.
Yeah.
So now with the Pigovian tax, we can get a socially optimal equilibrium.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so for Koch's theorem, there's a new thing called Koch's theorem, which argues that government intervention may not be needed to cure externality issues or underproduction issues. That efficient solutions can be achieved in our private markets without government intervention. For instance, airports can install soundproof windows to cure the noise pollution that nearby neighborhoods face. Maybe they're paid to do it, maybe out of just goodness of their hearts, something. Pollution firms can pay victims to settle. For instance, if they pollute the affected victims of pollution, the pollution firm can pay those victims a certain amount of money to satisfy that external cost, marginal external cost, or maybe the victims can negotiate the pollution firm to maybe pay back the pollution firm in order to get them to not pollute, things like that.
So basically, it's another way to without the government, but it's kind of like a private taxation. Okay, so
Koch's theorem, there's obviously a lot of problems with it. It's not really, really practical. Nobody really relies on it on a regular basis for good reason because it's way easier said than done. First of all, many firms may not have an incentive to cure externalities on their own. For instance, the airports in this case, the airport does not have really any obvious incentive to produce soundproof windows in this case, or pollution firms. It may be difficult for victims to band together to form like a union or something to negotiate with such a large, powerful pollution firm. It's not easy. It's not practical. So for our final clue is externality is a spillover effect, is an indirect effect of the market production or consumption, and so it causes, it's not accounted for by a pure private market, and so as a result the private market under or overproduces according to social benefit or social cost. And so a government subsidy or per unit or government tax per unit may help either, in case of the subsidy, achieve socially optimal solutions where MSC equals MSB, because education, vaccine, and things like that have positive externality that are often underconsumed, or in the case of negative externality, they're overconsumed, so the government tax will reduce production to cure that overproduction.
Yeah, it's kind of like weird because the good stuff always underconsumed, but bad stuff always overproduced. So the subsidy to encourage demand, right? And tax to discourage demand and supply.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's basically the whole concept, the new concept of externality, and I think that's pretty interesting and pretty useful in our real society. Okay. See you next time. Bye bye.